Hello, I'm Juan Gutierrez, and I'm talking today about political risk forecasting and mitigation, which is the topic that I have selected for my proposed research. In order to have a deeper understanding of this topic, I have selected political risk international business literature that first assesses and delineates the meaning and significance of political risk. Second, it examines the different types of methodologies used to analyze and forecast these political risk. Third, offers strategies of political risk mitigation for firms. And fourth and final, offers examples of how political risk studies are practically used in country-specific risk and in managerial decision making. So the first document that I've used to analyze my particular topic is Llewellyn Howell's Evaluating Political Risk Forecasting. What is very interesting about this particular document is that it does an expansive literature review of the main different political risk forecasting models and the main political risk definitions for business intelligence. And it utilizes these definitions to emphasize how they fail and how they relate to each other, and how, for practical use, they're very different from their theoretical approach. The methodology of this document is a qualitative comparative approach. It selects 12 of the most widely used political risk forecasting methods and separates the elements within them that relate to the origin of the political risk, whether it be societal, external, or governmental. And in a table, the author has illustrated how each political risk model relates to each of the particular dimensions related to the nature of the risk and how they relate to each other. The results of this document presented in two correctives, which are very important for any study in political risk. The first corrective is that differences in political type risk have to be, in general political risk, have to be isolated into specific types of political risk in order to have a practical approach that is successful. And the second is that as a critique of how current models are more of an analysis of current situations than a forecast themselves. The limitations of this study are related to how it focuses on indices that already exist, and the failings of indices that, while present and useful, are not necessarily the based on variables that it analyzes. So the differences, the wide differences that exist in the forecast models, can illustrate the limitations of this model, because of this document, because it only compares themselves to each other. It doesn't really go into depth for any one. The second document that I've used is a methodology for analyzing and forecasting sociopolitical destabilization. What's very interesting about this document as well is that it is a launching point for the research authors. Our launching point for the research authors is the mainly growing interest that exists in aiming to define the elements that isolate country destabilization or political risk. They do base themselves on authors that have already written expansively about this and the indices that are already created for identifying set elements. So based on these background theory, their methodology is qualitative because based on the selected factors, it's quantitative because based on the selected factors of country risk, the authors have created a relational approach to measure these factors quantitatively. This is very important because while the results of this study does not offer specific suggestions for the mitigation of country risk, it does outline how to measure them through a quantitative approach. And it also gives us a formula to relate the different variables with each other based on the relationship between the sociopolitical actors. The limitations of this study are clear, since it is a purely theoretical outline for understanding numerical indices, and it does give you an opportunity to understand the measurements of these systems in quantitative terms. It really does nothing in the critiquing how these factors were selected and how these factors affect political risk, or how these factors apply and how these numerical contexts apply in a world context. Then another document I've used is Risk in International Business and its Mitigation. The background theory of this is that authors identify expansive literature by, for example, Lewis and Bosos, that exists on how risk mitigation is tied to risk identification and market selection and market entry. They also identify how currently country risk is both a conceptually tenacious task because there's a lot of literature that is expansive on it, but it is empirically inconclusive because there are not that many methods like the one I talked about before that quantify set political country risk. The methodology for this document was mixed approach. They have a qualitative relational analysis of country assessment factors, and of managerial mitigation strategies based on business history. So they analyze how management takes decisions regarding country risk in history, but it also has a quantitative approach, which is the analysis of FDI as a measure of firm risk tolerance and country risk consequences, which is different from a lot of other political risk studies. Uh, the results of this is that the authors do an excellent job in delineating all the different strategies that exist to mitigate country risk and to assess risk itself. They also identify variances in risk assessments done by different firms with a similar strategic objective and different management approaches to reactions to risk that is endogenous as opposed to exogenous risk. The limitations of this document is that it is prone to measurement error problems and aggregation bias on omitted variables because it relies on previous models that already have established variables. So it can always be argued that you could add more variables, but they have limited themselves to utilizing variables created by somebody else. Fourth, I've taken global and country-specific geopolitical risk uncertainty and stock return for emerging economies. The background theory of this study is that it analyzes the nonlinear effects of the market switching approach. So it really does rely on the market switching approach for its entire approach, but it is a quantitative approach. And how it works is that it analyzes stock returns of a few countries employing a three regime, and it cross-references them to the specific patterns of country risk that have emerged in these countries. The results of this is that it elucidates how the market switching approach works in capturing the impacts of country risk where a linear framework does not. And also it reveals that political risk can affect stock market returns both positively and negatively, but it does depend on a variety of factors. And that unstable regime will almost always yield negative results on the stock market. The limitations for this study are that it merely delineates a correlation and it only quantifies through stock market returns, which can be subject to a lot of other variables aside from country risk that affect it. Which is why, while it's a very interesting measurement, it's not a particularly used one because it's not entirely reliable on country risk itself. Finally, the last document that I've used is When Political Instability Devaluates Home-Host Ties. And this is a very more specific approach of how political risk is used to understand political and economic relationships between countries. So the background theory of this study is very reliant on the definitions of home-host ties for international business companies, and it does focus on the dyadic links constituted by inter-country flows and relations that is the main theoretical framework for home-host ties literature. It adds to this literature significantly because it analyzes how the expansion decisions for multinational companies rely on the theoretical proposed relations that exist for political risk. Its methodology is purely qualitative, and the main measure for this paper are the analysis of decisions taken by multinational companies that relate to their expansion and correlating them with specific country risk and tension between home and host countries. The results for this document were that the findings of this study were in line with this proposed hypothesis, and it confirmed their underlying assumptions that while it's still not a definitive solution to the question of business during international conflict, it does point out that for minor political conflicts, institutional structure plays a non-significant limitation, but for full-fledged conflicts, the government is the major limited actor in increasing political risk. The limitations of the study finally are that it relates to the solid theoretical framework on the relationship that exists between managerial decisions and home-host country relations. And well, like I said before, this literature already exists, so they are basing themselves on definitions of home-host ties that already exist. Based on these literature, I have proposed these three research questions. Of course, none of them are set in stone, and I would love all feedback regarding them. The first is, how well does political risk forecasting help companies avoid value deterioration? Second is, how effective are political risk mitigation strategies when taken before or after market entry? And the third are how indicators of political risk affect overall FDI returns from foreign firms into a country. That offers a little bit more of a direct measurement within the proposed research question themselves.